Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're heading somewhere old. Not antique shop old, not grandma's basement old, but Europe in the Dark Ages old. A time when the nights were longer, the churches louder, and the average villager was one spooky noise away from inventing anxiety. So if you're already horizontal, congratulations. You're perfectly positioned to learn about how fear became a European export. Because tonight, we're tracing Halloween back to where it all began. Before pumpkins, before porch lights, before fun-size candy, that's a lie. There were bonfires on lonely hills, whispering fields, and people who believed that the dead didn't haunt them. They just visited. But before we open the creaky door of history, do yourself, and my fragile medieval ego, a favor. Hit that like button. Because nothing says, "I fear no ghost," quite like supporting a YouTube channel while lying under a blanket fort. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that too. Not because I'll curse your crops if you don't, but because somewhere out there, a 14th century monk is quietly updating your name on a parchment titled Unrepentant Sleepyheads. Now, take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the glow of your screen fade into something softer. Candlelight maybe, reflected on stone walls. Outside, it's raining gently. Inside, the hearth is crackling, and the air smells of peat and wood smoke. You're safe here. Well, mostly. Because in medieval Europe, safety was negotiable. The world was ruled by seasons, by faith, and by the occasional unexplained noise outside your window. When autumn arrived, the harvest ended, and the year itself began to die. And that, according to everyone from Irish druids to Italian monks, was when the border between the living and the dead grew thin. So thin that spirits could drift through doorways, walk through fields, or sit quietly beside the fire, listening to the living talk about them in nervous whispers. The people didn't fear this, not exactly. They respected it, the way you'd respect an uninvited dinner guest who could also smite your cow. They swept their floors, tidied their tables, and left bread by the door, just in case the dead were hungry after the long walk from eternity. Across the continent, the names changed, but the meaning didn't. In the Celtic lands, it was Samhain, the end of the light half of the year. In France, they called it the Feast of the Dead. In Germany, Allerheiligenabend, All Hallows' Eve. But whether you were lighting a torch in Ireland or tolling a bell in Bavaria, you were doing the same thing, keeping the dark polite. See, Europe didn't invent fear. It just gave it structure. If something frightened you, you didn't run. You lit a fire. If a ghost appeared, you invited it in for bread. If your candle flickered, you said a prayer, trimmed the wick, and assumed it was fine. And somehow, this blend of terror, tenderness, and mild denial became the foundation of what we now call Halloween. So tonight, we'll travel back through that world, through misty valleys and candlelit cottages, through cathedrals that rang with Latin hymns while peasants danced barefoot outside, through centuries of superstition, love, and the occasional haunted vegetable. We'll meet witches who never cackled, monks who accidentally invented jump scares, and bakers who discovered the true meaning of guilt in yeast form. We'll follow the crackling bonfires that rolled across Ireland, the solemn vigils of Italy, and the wild masquerades of Germany and France. All the strange, sleepy rituals that turned one night of the year into a bridge between worlds. It's a story about how people learned to live with death, how fear became festivity, and how an entire continent looked into the dark and decided to laugh softly instead of scream. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the air grow cooler, the candlelight sway, the faint echo of footsteps on cobblestone fading into mist. Outside your window, the old world is waking up again. A patchwork of tiny fires across the map of medieval Europe. They're waiting for us. They've been waiting for centuries. Because before Halloween was a holiday, before it was costumes and candy, it was simply a night when everyone agreed to keep a light burning. For the dead, for each other, and maybe, quietly, for themselves. Now, let's go find where that light first began to flicker. Picture this: Europe, 1,000 years ago. The map doesn't look quite right yet. Half the kingdoms don't have names. The other half are arguing about whose saint is taller, and the forests stretch so far that people whisper the trees can listen. It's autumn, or whatever they called it before calendars agreed on things. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. Fields are bare, hills are gold and gray, and every village sits like a small island of light surrounded by miles of very confident darkness. This was the season of endings. The harvest was done. The animals were brought in. The year itself felt tired, like an old man leaning on his scythe. And for the people of early Europe, that meant one thing: the world was about to get thin. Not metaphorically, spiritually thin. They believed that when the crops died and the leaves fell, the barrier between the living and the dead softened, just enough for a bit of cross-traffic. So, once a year, when the air grew sharp and the last fires of the harvest burned out, they prepared for company. Not the kind you dust the shelves for. The kind that walked through walls, remembered your name, and expected bread. This night was called Samhain in the Celtic lands, pronounced Samhain, because the Irish alphabet has always enjoyed confusing outsiders. It marked the end of the light half of the year, the beginning of the dark, and the moment when time folded over itself like wet parchment. According to legend, the old gods of the hills rose to walk among mortals. Spirits roamed the roads, searching for warmth and recognition, and the people, practical, slightly terrified, and possibly tipsy, decided to turn fear into a festival. They built fires, huge ones, bonfires on hillsides that could be seen for miles, licking the night sky with orange tongues. The flames weren't just for warmth. They were invitations, signals to the spirits that the living still remembered them, but also polite warnings not to linger too long. The fires danced, and so did the shadows. Villagers gathered, singing, laughing, tossing handfuls of herbs and salt into the flames to keep the ghosts comfortable, but not chatty. Children chased sparks through the grass. Dogs barked at nothing in particular, possibly theology. In those moments, fear became community. People who might have barely spoken all year stood shoulder to shoulder, faces glowing, eyes reflecting firelight and superstition in equal measure. They didn't know it, but they were inventing the first Halloween, not with candy, but with courage. For them, darkness wasn't evil, it was alive. The night wasn't something to banish. It was something to respect. The Celts believed that the dead weren't gone. They were simply elsewhere, waiting for permission to visit. The fires were that permission. Each home took a flame from the communal bonfire to relight their hearths. It was called the need fire because everyone needed it. Warmth, safety, continuity. In a world where winters could steal both crops and comfort, the flame meant survival. When the fires burned low, people performed little rituals, quiet, secret things. They'd write wishes or worries on scraps of wood and toss them into the embers, watching them curl and blacken. Some scattered crumbs for lost ancestors. Others whispered names into the smoke, hoping their words would rise high enough to reach someone who might be listening. No one thought of it as magic. It was just manners. Because in early Europe, manners extended to the dead. You didn't slam doors, you didn't whistle after dark, and you certainly didn't insult a drafty corner. There might be someone in it. The church hadn't yet arrived to tidy things up, so these customs roamed free, half prayer, half party. People wore bits of animal hide to confuse wandering spirits. They left out food so the ghosts wouldn't knock on the door. And If your neighbor's lantern blew out suddenly, you politely pretended not to notice, because relighting it might be someone else's job. To us, it sounds eerie. To them, it was comfort. Imagine living in a world without electricity, medicine, or reliable weather forecasts. The dark wasn't just an absence of light, it was an entire season, a presence. You could feel it pressing at the windows, breathing down the chimney, waiting for the fire to falter. So, they learned to dance with it. They didn't conquer their fear, they gave it rhythm. They turned superstition into story, story into ritual, and ritual into reassurance. Every flame on every hill was a small rebellion against despair. And maybe that's why we still light candles when things get hard. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now. The crackle of peat, the soft hum of voices rising against the wind, the ancient heartbeat of a festival born from equal parts hunger and hope. The shadows sway across the fields, but they don't frighten anyone. They move like dancers, slow, uncertain, learning their steps from the fire. And in that flickering glow, you realize something beautiful. Fear, when shared, becomes warmth. Darkness, when named, becomes story. And the people who once trembled at the edge of winter were already teaching the rest of us how to face it. If you stood on a hillside in ancient Europe at the end of October, you'd have seen something breathtaking. A necklace of fire stretching across the land. From the cliffs of Ireland to the valleys of Gaul, flames crowned every hilltop, flickering like stars that had decided to take a vacation on Earth. This was no random pyromania. It was ritual. The great Samhain fires, lit to guard the living, honor the dead, and possibly roast whatever root vegetables hadn't been stolen by neighbors. Fire, to the early Europeans, was everything. It was warmth, protection, and a Wi-Fi signal to the divine. It connected people not only to one another, but to the gods, the ancestors, and all the things that couldn't be seen, but definitely had opinions. When the sun sank and the fog crept in, people felt the world tilt slightly toward the other side. The air itself seemed to listen. And so, to keep the silence from getting ideas, they built fires that roared loud enough to remind the dark who was boss. In the Celtic lands, each village extinguished its hearths before dusk, a dangerous act of trust. For a few hours, every home went dark, the air thick with cold and anticipation. Then, at the signal from the hill, the communal fire was lit. From that sacred blaze, runners carried torches through the fields, their light bobbing like fireflies on a mission. Every family rekindled their hearth from this shared flame, tying the community together in one glowing web of safety. If your neighbor's fire burned from the same spark as yours, you were bound by warmth, by duty, by shared fear of whatever was lurking outside the fence. The church, centuries later, would call this pagan nonsense. The villagers called it Tuesday, because fire wasn't just ceremony, it was survival science. It kept the wolves back, the damp away, and the dead politely on their side of things. And, as a bonus, it made a great excuse to stay up past bedtime. Imagine it. The night air cold enough to make your breath visible, the hills alive with orange light. Shepherds, bakers, and barefoot children gather around the flames, their faces painted in ash and awe. Some sing. Some tell stories about the year's harvest. Others mutter charms under their breath, hoping to borrow a bit of the fire's courage for the long winter ahead. At the edge of the crowd, someone throws a pinch of salt into the blaze, a gift for the spirits. The sparks rise in a swarm, tiny souls spiraling upward. Children point and whisper that each one is a ghost finding its way home. Adults smile, pretending not to believe it while silently believing it completely. The air hums with that strange European blend of faith and fear, a sound halfway between prayer and laughter. And across the valleys, other hills answer, one fire calling to another, a chain reaction of hope. In the East, among the Slavs, there were similar rites. Families would gather around ancestor fires, speaking the names of their dead aloud so no spirit would feel forgotten. In the North, the Norse called it Alfablot, a private feast for the departed, where ale flowed as freely as philosophy. Everywhere you went, the message was the same: light something, remember someone, and don't leave the dark uninvited. Fire had rules. You couldn't let it die before dawn. That would bring bad luck, or worse, bad gossip. You couldn't spit into it, disrespectful to the spirits. And if the smoke blew toward you, you were blessed or doomed, depending on who you asked and how much ale they'd had. Even centuries later, when the church tried to Christianize the holiday into All Hallows' Eve, the people kept their fires. Priests sprinkled holy water on the bonfires, calling them vigil flames. The villagers nodded politely and kept tossing herbs and bones in anyway. Religion may have changed, but fire was still fluent in both languages. One 12th century monk in Brittany described watching from the monastery window as villagers danced around the hill fires. They leapt, he wrote, as though to leave behind their sins in the smoke. He didn't mention that half the monastery joined them after Compline, which, frankly, feels like an omission. In the flicker of those flames, fear became festive. The firelight flattened hierarchies. Lord and laborer, priest and shepherd, all were just faces in the glow. No one looked rich in firelight. No one looked poor. Everyone looked human, fragile, hopeful, warmed by something they didn't entirely understand. And maybe that's why Halloween endured, because it began with people who refused to let the dark win quietly. The night might belong to the spirits, but the fire belonged to them, to the living, to the cold-fingered children, to the farmers staring at the sky and thinking, maybe, just maybe, this year's harvest meant they'd done something right. When the fires finally burned low, families carried home glowing embers wrapped in clay or moss. The flames hissed softly, the smoke curling like the breath of old gods. Inside, the hearths came alive again, one by one, small suns blooming in the darkness. The hills went quiet. The stars came out. And across Europe, for just one night, the line between heaven and earth glowed orange. Because the people of the old world didn't fear the dark after all. They just needed a reason to dance in it. By the time the last sheaf of grain fell to the sickle, the fields of medieval Europe had grown quiet. Too quiet. The crows had eaten their fill, the wagons were full, and the villagers were left standing on stubble and superstition. Because once the harvest was over, something strange lingered in the air, a feeling that the land itself was holding its breath. The people believed that when the final stalk was cut, the spirit of the crop, the very soul of the grain, had nowhere left to live. It wandered, lost, restless. Some called it the Corn Mother. Others said the Barley Bride, the Old Lady, or if they were having a particularly bad year, the Grain Wolf. Names varied, but the message was the same. The harvest wasn't just food, it was alive. So to keep that spirit from sulking, the villagers gave it a body. They bundled the last sheaf of wheat into a doll, tall, braided, crowned with ribbons and scraps of cloth. Sometimes it had a face drawn in ash, sometimes just the vague dignity of straw and string. Then they carried it home as though it were royalty. The Corn Mother sat above the hearth all winter, a silent guardian made of gratitude and leftover carbohydrates. She represented the promise that spring would return, that life would wake up again. As long as she stayed dry and respected, the next year's harvest would thrive. But if she went moldy, or heaven forbid, got nibbled by a goat, everyone braced for famine. So yes, the Middle Ages had their version of a household security system, a scarecrow goddess made of straw. In England, they'd wrap her in linen and call her the Old Woman. In Germany, they called her Die Alte. In Ireland, she was the Maiden of the Fields. Whatever her name, she was treated with tender formality. Some families offered her bits of bread or milk, others sang to her. If that sounds strange, remember, this was an era when you could be tried for talking to cats, so singing to straw was practically mainstream. Sometimes, instead of keeping her indoors, they buried the last sheaf back into the soil, not as disposal, but as a promise. Sleep now, and rise again. It was an earthy kind of resurrection, no sermon, no Latin, just the whisper of hope folded into dirt. The harvest festivals themselves were a cheerful contradiction, half thanksgiving, half apology. People ate, danced, drank, and thanked every saint they could name for letting them survive another season. But they also knew winter was coming, and gratitude alone didn't keep you warm. So they added fire. Lots of it. Huge bonfires blazed across Europe in those golden weeks after the harvest. They burned not just to celebrate abundance, but to ward off whatever spirits might be jealous of it. Firelight flickered across piles of apples, loaves of bread, and barrels of ale, all offerings to both heaven and soil. In some regions, people tossed bits of bread into the flames for the dead who fed the living. In others, they poured ale on the ground so the earth could drink first. It's oddly touching, this mix of fear and kindness, reverence and practicality. Medieval people didn't separate the sacred from the everyday. Plowing was prayer, harvest was hymn, fire was a sermon that didn't need words, but not every spirit was friendly. When crops failed, and they often did, the villagers blamed the angry grain spirit. Maybe someone had forgotten to sing the right song, or dropped a crumb without saying thank you. Some even said that the spirit took revenge, wandering through the fields at night, whispering the names of those who'd neglected her. Travelers swore they saw shapes moving through the stubble, women made of straw, or shadows that bowed and swayed though no wind blew. One story from 13th century Bavaria tells of a farmer who mocked the old harvest songs and left his last sheaf unbound. That winter, his fields froze early, and his cattle refused to eat the hay. He was found wandering the barn at dawn, muttering apologies to someone no one else could see. After that, no one in the village ever skipped the ritual again, and maybe, just maybe, it worked. Because year after year the cycle continued. Seed, harvest, sleep, repeat. Fear didn't paralyze them, it structured them. The idea that every stalk had a spirit gave meaning to backbreaking work. It turned the act of cutting wheat into a kind of communion. Even now, remnants of that belief survive. We hang wheat wreaths at autumn, tie ribbons around bread loaves, and bake harvest knots without realizing that we're still feeding an ancient superstition. That abundance is never free, it's borrowed, and it has to be honored. As the fires burned low and the songs softened into murmurs, the villagers packed away the last of the grain. They touched the corn mother's straw hand for luck, whispered her name, and went inside. Outside, the fields were silent again, blanketed in fog and moonlight. But if you stood there long enough, you might swear you heard something, a soft rustle, a sigh, maybe even laughter carried on the wind. Not the sound of ghosts exactly, just the earth, exhaling after a long year of work. And somewhere, in the warm light of a cottage, a tiny straw figure sat watching over the sleeping world. A reminder that even in death, life finds a way to linger. When Rome finally reached the misty edges of Northern Europe, it didn't just bring legions and Latin. It brought something even more unstoppable, paperwork. And in that paperwork, somewhere between new taxes and please stop worshiping rocks, the church found a problem. The locals really liked setting things on fire. To the Romans and early Christian missionaries, the pagan bonfires of Samhain looked like chaos. Fields full of smoke, people wearing animal skins, and priests muttering into cauldrons. To the villagers, it was just tradition. A family event, really, with more singing and slightly fewer arrests. At first, the missionaries tried to ban it. They marched into villages with stern faces and the kind of optimism only possible before encountering a tipsy Celtic farmer with a torch. They called the fires heathen idolatry, which sounds impressive until you realize it just means stuff we don't like but can't stop. But over time, Rome learned a lesson familiar to anyone who's ever tried to get a cat off a warm laptop. If you can't move it, rename it. So the church didn't destroy Samhain. It rebranded it. They created All Saints' Day on November 1st, followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd. Together they became a kind of spiritual 2-for-1. One day for the saints, one day for everyone else who hadn't made the cut. And the night before, October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve. Sound familiar? It was brilliant strategy. You could still light candles for the dead, sing songs, and feast until dawn. You just had to say it was for the saints now. Rome basically invented the medieval version of corporate synergy. But out in the countryside, things weren't quite so tidy. While priests were chanting psalms inside stone chapels, villagers were still lighting fires outside and dancing around them. The priests called it heathen influence. The villagers called it Tuesday night. Some churches even started lighting their own holy fires, just to stay competitive. They sprinkled holy water on the bonfires, threw in a few relics, and declared the flames sanctified. The peasants nodded, smiled, and kept tossing herbs and bones into the mix. Everyone pretended it was the same thing. A monk named Alcuin of York, the kind of man who had never known a good party, complained that the people of the north still leap through fire, saying pagan words under Christian skies. You can practically hear the sigh in his ink. But the truth is, Christianity didn't erase paganism overnight. It negotiated with it. Europe became a giant cultural compromise, half sermon, half superstition. The church bells and the bonfires weren't rivals, they were dance partners. The bells were for heaven, the fires for earth, and together they kept the world turning. Picture a medieval village on All Hallows' Eve. The sky is low, gray, and heavy. The fields are dark and wet. The air tastes of smoke and cider. Inside the church, candles burn beside relics. Outside, flames leap higher than rooftops. Children run between both worlds, carrying torches, singing prayers, and occasionally setting their sleeves on fire. It was messy, beautiful, and deeply human. In France, priests began holding processions to bless the harvest fire. In England, they called it Hallowtide, and villagers brought their last sheaf of grain to church before tossing it in the flames. In parts of Italy, people baked pane dei morti, bread of the dead, to share after Mass. Somewhere along the way, the line between honoring God and bribing ghosts got blurry. But nobody minded, as long as the bread stayed warm and the ale stayed flowing. There's an old story from a monastery in Brittany. On All Hallows' Eve, a monk looked out the window and saw villagers dancing around the fires in the fields. When he scolded them, they invited him to join. He refused until he noticed one of them had brought cheese. Then, mysteriously, he was there to bless the fire. That's how Europe worked, a constant dance between rules and rebellion, incense and smoke, Latin prayers and local songs. Over the centuries, All Hallows' Eve spread across the continent, glowing softly under a patchwork of languages. In Germany, it was Allerheiligen Abend. In Spain, Noche de las Animas. In France, La Toussaint. Each version had its own flavor. A bit of church, a bit of folklore, and just enough fire to make the saints nervous. By the 10th century, Samhain and All Hallows' Eve were completely tangled together. You couldn't separate them anymore. Pagan fire had become Christian candlelight, and Christian ritual had borrowed a little of the old pagan mischief. In a way, it was the most European solution imaginable. Argue about theology for 400 years, then decide to keep both. And maybe that's why Halloween still feels so layered, sacred and silly, peaceful and eerie, saintly, and a little bit drunk, because from the very beginning, it was a compromise, a marriage between faith and fear that neither side ever quite divorced. As the night deepens, the bells ring over the hills, answering the last crackle of the dying bonfires. For a moment, the two sounds mingle, one calling to heaven, one echoing from the earth. The wind carries both. And somewhere between them, the people of Europe, tired, faithful, superstitious, and beautifully stubborn, find peace in the glow. By the Middle Ages, Europe had become a continent of bells. They rang for births and deaths, for weddings and warnings, for prayers, plagues, coronations, and the occasional cow that wandered too close to the steeple. In towns and villages alike, the sound of bells stitched time together, a bronze heartbeat echoing from valley to valley. But on one night of the year, All Hallows' Eve, those bells did something more mysterious. They didn't just tell time, they spoke to the dead. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. As the sun sank on October 31st, the air thickened with smoke and candlelight. Villagers hurried home from the fields, locking doors and whispering prayers, because once the first bell tolled, the boundary between worlds began to blur. In churches across Europe, monks and priests gathered for vigils, bell ringing for the souls. Each ring, they said, carried a message through the veil. We remember you. And the dead, being polite, were expected to listen. The sound rolled across rooftops and through foggy fields, deep and steady. To the living, it was comfort. To the restless, it was a guide. Because the bells, people said, could call wandering souls out of the dark and help them find their way to rest. In some villages, the ringing lasted all night. They called it the passing bell, and the rhythm mattered, slow for peace, fast for joy, and somewhere in between for please don't haunt us. Children were told that each toll freed one soul from purgatory. Parents nodded gravely and said yes, so you'd better behave, because mischief after dark might send a ghost right back. The monasteries took it seriously. Records from 12th century France mention monks tolling bells for the comfort of the unseen, while peasants waited outside with candles and baskets of bread for the poor. Each loaf given was another prayer released. Each bell rung was another soul remembered. It was a ritual that turned sound into salvation, a medieval kind of music therapy. But as with all things medieval, the line between holy and haunted got blurry fast. Because while some said the bells kept spirits at bay, others whispered that the sound invited them, that the clang of iron through mist was irresistible to ghosts, like a dinner bell for the afterlife. So while the church towers rang proudly, some villagers did the opposite. They stuffed cloth into their windows, covered their ears, and refused to step outside until the last echo faded. If you heard a bell ringing without a hand on the rope, they said, it meant a soul had come to ring it for itself. There's a story from Wales about a boy named Emrys who volunteered to ring the church bell on Halloween night. He climbed the tower at dusk, lit his candle, and began to pull the rope. The sound rolled through the valley, slow, beautiful, heavy. But when the villagers came to relieve him at dawn, the bell was still swinging. And the tower was empty. Only the rope was warm. After that, no one in that parish ever rang the midnight bell alone again. Not that they stopped entirely, they just got creative. In England, people began to make soul bells, small handbells you could ring at home, safely indoors. Families told them at their hearths while whispering prayers for their ancestors. It was quieter, cozier, and less likely to involve spontaneous ghost employment. Across Europe, variations multiplied. In Germany, they called it Totenglock, the death bell. In Italy, Campana delle Anime. In France, La Cloche des Morts. Each one claimed to protect a different kind of soul, the lost, the lonely, or the simply forgetful. The church, for once, didn't complain. If anything, it approved. Better to ring a bell for a ghost than accidentally summon one with witchcraft, they reasoned, which, in fairness, was solid risk management. Some monks even claimed to hear responses. One wrote that, as his brothers sang Dies Irae in the candlelit chapel, faint voices echoed from the graveyard outside, not wailing, but singing along. He noted this calmly, as if it were perfectly normal for the dead to harmonize. Then he added, "It was not unpleasant." There's something strangely touching in that. The idea that sound, just simple vibration through air, could bridge two worlds for a moment. Imagine it. The night cold and silver, the stars sharp and clear. The great church bell swings in its tower, each strike rolling like thunder over the fields. In the cottages below, children pull blankets over their heads, dogs whine softly, candles tremble, and out there, in the mist, the souls pause, listening. Maybe that's what comfort sounded like in the Middle Ages, a slow, solemn note that said, "You're not forgotten." When the bells finally stopped, silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like a deep breath held by the whole village at once. The people returned to their homes, banked the fires, and slept in the faint echo of bronze and prayer. Outside, the fog curled around the tower like smoke. The bell cooled, and for one more night, heaven and earth had managed to hold a conversation. Brief, gentle, and almost human. Because in a world where darkness stretched for miles and faith was the only light, a single sound could make you believe that somewhere, someone, was still listening. If you'd been alive in medieval Europe, there was one rule everyone agreed on. You did not travel after dark. The roads weren't just dangerous, they were alive. By day, those winding dirt paths were ordinary. Wagons creaked, pilgrims trudged, monks muttered about blisters. But once the sun sank and the mist rolled in, the roads changed character, like polite acquaintances who became unpredictable after their third goblet of ale. People said that when the church bells tolled midnight, the dead took to the roads, not to haunt exactly, but to wander. It was their one night off from eternity. Across Europe, they called them by different names. In Germany, Die Totenweg, the ways of the dead. In Wales, Bush y Corff, the corpse paths. In England, simply the churchway, because everyone knew that bodies and souls took the same route to their final resting place. Travelers avoided them after sunset. Even animals did. There are old stories of oxen refusing to cross a certain bend in the road, their hooves trembling on the dirt, ears twitching at something no human could hear. And yet, sometimes, you had no choice. Picture a tinker or merchant in the year 1380, making his way home from a distant market. His cart creaks, the lantern flickers, the wind sighs through the hedgerows like someone quietly breathing. He tells himself he's not afraid, that the stories are just stories. But then, he hears footsteps, soft ones behind him, keeping perfect pace. He turns, nothing there, just the fog thickening, the road shimmering faintly as though moonlight were seeping up from underneath. In France, they said those were the chemins des âmes, paths of souls. At midnight, they glowed faintly, lit by the footsteps of the departed retracing their funeral routes. If you saw them, it meant the boundary between worlds was open and you were standing on the border crossing. The polite thing to do was step aside and bow. You didn't want to be mistaken for one of them. Medieval Europe loved its rules for ghosts. You couldn't whistle after dark, it called them closer. You couldn't look back if you heard your name whispered. And if you saw a candle flame hovering in the fog, you absolutely did not follow it. Those lights were called will-o'-the-wisps, or jack-o'-lanterns, mischievous spirits said to lure travelers into swamps and bogs. They danced just far enough ahead to look helpful, then disappeared the moment you stepped off the path. The moral, as always, never trust customer service in the afterlife. But not every encounter was sinister. In England, they said that if you met a silent traveler on the road, hooded, barefoot, eyes down, it was a soul from purgatory walking its penance. If you offered a prayer, the figure would bow and vanish. If you ignored it, it might join you until dawn, quiet, steady, patient. The church mostly disapproved of these stories, calling them peasant fancies. But privately, some priests admitted they believed. Monks on pilgrimage wrote of seeing lines of pale figures drifting across crossroads, moving toward the nearest churchyard. One described them as like candles walking through fog, light without heat, peace without sound. It's oddly comforting, that idea. The dead not as horror, but as movement, still keeping the old roads company long after the living had gone to sleep. Sometimes the legends turned darker. In the forests of Germany, they spoke of the wild hunt, an endless procession of riders thundering through the night sky. If you heard their horns, you dropped to the ground and prayed, because the hunters weren't after deer. They were chasing lost souls, gathering them like leaves in a storm. But even that story wasn't pure terror. People said the hunt only rode when the world was out of balance, when crops failed, or wars raged, or too many had died unburied. The sound of their galloping hooves meant that someone, somewhere, was still keeping the score between heaven and earth. In other words, bureaucracy, but with horses. To medieval villagers, the roads were arteries of the world, not just dirt and direction, but veins carrying life, death, and everything in between. If you looked after them, swept them, blessed them, the world stayed healthy. If you neglected them, things went wrong. Bad harvests, bad dreams, bad luck. So every year, around All Hallows' Eve, villagers walked the roads by daylight, scattering herbs, sprinkling holy water, and whispering the names of those who had died that year. It was a kind of maintenance, a yearly handshake with whatever unseen traffic passed through at night. Then, when the sun fell, the world was handed back to the other travelers. The living stayed indoors. The dead took their turn. You can almost picture it. Mist curling low, moonlight pooling in the ruts of the road, and a quiet procession of shadows moving toward the horizon. No moaning, no rattling chains, just the soft rhythm of footsteps and the faint glimmer of candlelight in the fog. They were said to disappear at the first hint of dawn, melting into the light like frost on stone. By morning, the roads looked the same, muddy, empty, harmless. But if you bent down, you might notice something strange. No footprints, only a faint warmth in the ground, as if someone had passed by not long ago. And maybe would again next year. Because in the Europe of the dead, the journey was never quite over, and every road still remembered who walked it. If you've ever put on a Halloween costume and felt a tiny thrilling shift in who you are, a little freer, a little bolder, maybe just a little creepier, congratulations. You've just reenacted one of Europe's oldest survival tactics. Because in the Middle Ages, dressing up wasn't just for fun, it was for protection. When the church tried to replace the old Samhain fires with tidy candlelit prayers, the peasants kept one custom alive, the art of pretending not to be themselves. They called it guising, from the word disguise. And it worked like this. If the dead were walking among the living on All Hallows' Eve, the safest thing to do was to blend in. So, when the sun set and the fog began to breathe along the ground, villagers smeared their faces with soot, threw on rags, and slipped through the dark dressed as the very things they feared. A simple idea, really. If you can't escape the ghosts, confuse them. In Ireland, people wore animal skins and carried skulls as masks. In Scotland, children rubbed their faces with ashes and wore straw wigs that made them look like walking scarecrows. In the forests of Germany, they donned furs and horns, pretending to be spirits of the woods themselves. And in France, where they never missed a chance to make fear fashionable, they crafted masks from carved bark and painted them with crushed berries. There was no wrong way to do it, as long as you looked sufficiently alarming and mildly unholy. By the 13th century, Guising had spread across Europe like spilled candle wax. Villagers went door to door in disguise, carrying lanterns made from hollowed-out turnips, singing short rhymes or muttering blessings for the dead. It was a mixture of prayer, prank, and performance art, a traveling theater of shadows moving through the night. And somewhere between superstition and entertainment, the first spark of modern Halloween took shape. Of course, not everyone approved. Priests frowned upon the masks, warning that those who pretend to be spirits may attract the company of real ones. Which, let's be honest, was exactly what made it exciting. But the villagers didn't see it as rebellion. To them, it was courtesy, a way of showing respect to the wandering dead without losing your own soul in the process. You weren't mocking the spirits, you were keeping them company, safely, behind a mask. There's a lovely paradox there. The more you hid your face, the closer you felt to the mysteries of the night. Picture a small medieval village under a pale October moon. Lanterns flicker in the windows. The air smells of peat and apples. Down the lane, a dozen figures shuffle past, some draped in furs, some wrapped in cloth, one definitely wearing a bucket. They knock on doors softly and sing, "Souls of the night, souls of the free, light us your fire and mercy shall be." The families inside hand out bread, cider, or a bit of smoked meat, a kind of edible insurance policy. In exchange, the geysers whisper blessings, cross themselves, and vanish into the mist. It was eerie, yes, but also joyful. A night when fear turned theatrical and the whole community played along. Masks had power in the medieval imagination. They weren't just concealment, they were transformation. In a world ruled by hierarchy, where your birth defined your fate, a mask was freedom. For one night, the beggar could be a king, the monk could be a demon, the widow could be an angel or a fox. The rules of life paused and everyone became someone else. In that way, guising wasn't only about spirits. It was about balance, about reminding the living that death might be waiting, but life still had jokes to tell. There's a chronicle from a small village in Cornwall that describes a Halloween when the entire town gathered in the square wearing masks made of bark. They danced around a bonfire, laughing and chanting nonsense. The local priest arrived, horrified, and demanded to know what they were doing. A masked man answered, "We're being ourselves." That was the secret no sermon could erase. The masks didn't hide their humanity, they celebrated it. Over time, guising became more elaborate. In northern France, people wore wings and halos to trick the spirits into thinking heaven had already claimed them. In Tahé, Germany, young men carved grotesque wooden faces called larvae, painting them in soot and chalk to mimic devils. They'd leap through the fire and shout blessings that sounded suspiciously like threats. It was chaos, faith, and theater all at once. A perfect medieval cocktail. Even today, when we pull on costumes and wander from door to door, we're echoing those villagers. The laughter, the flickering lights, the strange thrill of being unrecognizable for one night. It's all part of the same old dance. Back then, the masks came off when the church bells rang for midnight. The fires dimmed, and people hurried home before the ghosts realized the trick. Doors closed, latches clicked. Inside, they whispered a prayer, set a candle by the window, and waited for dawn. Outside, the wind moved through the empty streets, brushing over dropped masks and smoldering ashes. For a moment, you might think the night itself was smiling, amused by how well its children had learned to imitate it. Because long before Halloween became a parade of pirates and princesses, it was a night when the living borrowed the faces of the dead and discovered, in that borrowed darkness, how much fun it could be to be afraid together. Every village had one. A woman who lived just a little too far from the center of town knew a little too much about herbs and had a cat that frankly made too much eye contact. The Middle Ages called her many names: the wise woman, the midwife, the healer, the spinner, the widow. But eventually, as superstition fermented into paranoia, those names blurred into one: the witch. Now, forget the broomsticks and bubbling cauldrons for a moment. Medieval witches didn't fly, not yet. They walked, usually barefoot. And if you'd asked one what she was, she might have said something like, "I'm just good with rosemary." But on Halloween, or rather All Hallows' Eve, when the fires burned and the air turned thin as breath, people swore these women worked in shadow. They whispered over herbs. They muttered blessings or curses, depending on how polite you'd been at the market. And sometimes, very quietly, they helped. You see, witchcraft in medieval Europe wasn't about evil. It was about agency. When the church held the keys to heaven, and the Lord held the keys to your rent, the village healer held the keys to survival. She knew which roots cured fever, which smoke eased childbirth, and which prayer or potion to mutter over the baby's crib so it wouldn't stop breathing in the night. For a while, everyone respected her, or at least tolerated her. You might clutch your rosary a bit tighter when she walked past, but you still sent for her when your cow stopped producing milk. Fear and gratitude were two sides of the same medieval coin. But when something went wrong, a stillborn child, a ruined harvest, a mysterious illness, that same respect curdled into blame. The world didn't have doctors, meteorologists, or germ theory. It had witches. And witches made excellent scapegoats. Halloween, the night when the dead were said to wander, was also the night when accusations did. People saw shapes in the fog and decided someone must have put them there. Someone with a crooked back. Someone with herbs hanging from her ceiling. Someone who laughed a little too softly when the priest preached about sin. In England, they called them wise wives. In France, les bonnes femmes. In Germany, die Kräuterweiber, the herb women. The names were kind until they weren't. The first written accusation of witchcraft tied to Halloween dates back to 1324. When a wealthy woman named Alice Keiteler in Ireland was charged with sacrificing to demons on All Hallows' Eve. Her real crime? Lending money at interest, which, at the time, was considered more satanic than goat sacrifices. She escaped, but her servant didn't. And so began centuries of confusion between folk medicine and forbidden magic. But for most medieval people, witches weren't the stuff of fear. They were the stuff of gossip. Everyone knew who they were, and everyone pretended not to. They lived on the edge of the forest, where nettles grew tall and visitors came only when desperate. Their homes smelled of herbs and smoke, and the kind of secrecy that made priests nervous. If you had a nightmare, you might say a witch rode your chest in your sleep. If your butter curdled, you'd mutter that one had walked past your window. If your child recovered from a fever overnight, you'd thank God loudly. But slip a loaf of bread to the witch in the morning. It was a strange truce, written in crumbs and silence. And on Halloween night, the witches were said to gather. Not on broomsticks. That myth came later, borrowed from pagan fertility rituals and a few imaginative monks with too much free time. No. These witches met at the crossroads. They built small fires, whispered charms, and mixed herbs to protect the village from sickness. The irony, of course, being that they were saving the same people who might accuse them the next day. The church hated this duality. Priests preached that the only proper prayers were spoken in Latin, which most villagers didn't speak. The witches, meanwhile, prayed in the language of the earth, simple, rhythmic, and annoyingly effective. One medieval chronicler complained that the women of the countryside cure faster than the clergy. He meant it as an accusation. It reads more like a Yelp review. In time, superstition and theology brewed a potent mix. The witch became a convenient symbol of everything Europe feared: the night, the unknown, the independent woman with opinions about soup. But beneath the myths, there's tenderness. Because when you strip away the panic and the prejudice, you find a story about people, especially women, trying to keep their Families alive in a world ruled by plague, poverty, and unpredictable gods. They didn't summon darkness, they worked in it. And maybe that's why witches still fascinate us, because they were the first people who looked at the chaos of the world and said, "Fine, if no one else will fix it, I'll learn how." So on Halloween night, when the fog creeps low and the wind sounds suspiciously like whispering, don't picture a cackling crone flying through the sky. Picture a tired woman stirring herbs in a clay pot, murmuring a prayer that no one taught her, and smiling when the fire doesn't go out. The witch next door was never the villain. She was the quiet, stubborn heartbeat of a frightened world, and, like all good magic, she survived. There's something about a single candle in a window that can change an entire night. It doesn't matter if you're in a city, a village, or a lonely farmhouse miles from anyone else. That tiny flame means someone's awake, someone's home, someone's waiting. For medieval Europe, that small light carried far more weight than comfort. It was a message to the dead. On All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary between worlds was said to grow thin, people lit candles in their windows to guide wandering souls home. Not to haunt, not to frighten, but to remind them they were remembered. It was called the Soul Light in England, Lichtlein in Germany, and La Lumière des Morts in France, the light of the dead. In every language, it meant the same thing. You are gone, but not lost. For most of Europe, the tradition began quietly, centuries before anyone said the word Halloween. It grew from an older, simpler belief that death wasn't an end, but a distance. And distances, as every traveler knew, could be crossed with the right light. Imagine a narrow village lane on the last night of October. The wind tugs at the thatch. The trees whisper secrets in a language older than prayer. And in each cottage, someone lights a candle and sets it by the window. The wax flickers against the glass, throwing tiny shapes across the room. Shadows that look, if you're tired enough, a bit like people standing just outside. Children asked who the candles were for. Your grandfather, their mothers said. Your sister, or the good souls who have no one to light one for them. And then, always, don't blow it out. Because the flame wasn't just memory, it was invitation. The souls who returned on All Hallows' Eve were not monsters or mischief makers. They were travelers, hungry for warmth and recognition. Some said they could only enter homes where a light had been left burning. Others said they stood outside, gazing at the candle like an old friend they couldn't quite reach. So people left food with the light, a crust of bread, a bowl of milk, an apple split in two. In parts of Ireland, it was called a soul supper. In Poland, Gia Jadi, offerings for ancestors. In Italy, the Cena dei Morti, where families dined in silence, believing unseen guests sat beside them. These weren't morbid rituals. They were love stories, written in wax and smoke. In Brittany, children made small boats from hollowed turnips, placed candles inside, and floated them down rivers to guide spirits who'd died at sea. In the Alps, shepherds lit lanterns and hung them on fence posts to help the souls of lost travelers find their way home through the passes. And in England, poor parishioners walked from house to house, carrying candles and singing, a soul for a soul cake. Pray, good missus, a soul to take." Each cake given was a promise. One soul remembered, one prayer said. It was gentle, practical theology, carbohydrates as compassion. The church approved of this version, of course. It turned an old pagan gesture into Christian charity. But underneath, the candle still burned for the same reason it always had: to hold back the loneliness of death. There are medieval diaries that describe how the candle flame behaved. If it guttered suddenly, someone's soul had just passed. If it burned tall and straight, the spirit was content. And if two flames bent toward each other, it meant reunion. The superstition gave people a language for grief, one that didn't require words. When loss was constant and death an everyday visitor, the small act of lighting a candle was a way to talk to the silence. In truth, it's a conversation that never stopped. If you walk through any European village on All Saints' Night today, you'll still see windows glowing softly, candles flickering behind lace curtains, families whispering names that history forgot but love didn't. It's easy to imagine those first medieval homes, tiny wooden rooms, smoke curling from hearths, a single candle trembling in a clay holder. Outside, the fields are black, the roads are empty, and yet the world doesn't feel alone. Because somewhere in that dark, the old ones are walking home again. The flame draws them in, softly, gently, as if it knows their steps. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's faith, or maybe it's just the human instinct to light something when the dark feels too deep. Either way, the candle in the window became the most enduring symbol of Halloween. Not fear, not trickery, but connection. It said, "We still remember. We're still here. Come closer, just for a moment, and rest." And as the wax burned low and the light wavered, people didn't feel haunted. They felt seen. Because for all the centuries that followed, the bonfires, the costumes, the superstition, Halloween remained, at its quietest core, a night of homecomings. A single flame against the dark, waiting for a knock that never frightened anyone. If there's one thing humanity has always been good at, it's finding reasons to eat. Births, weddings, harvests, new, kings, good weather, all fair excuses for a feast. But once upon a time, Europe invented a dinner that no one touched. They called it the dumb supper. Not dumb as in foolish, but dumb as in silent. It was a meal for the dead, set on Halloween night, eaten in whispers or not at all. The rules were simple. You laid out food, but you didn't speak. You set places, but you didn't expect company you could see. You served the best of what you had: bread, apples, butter, wine, and when the church bells tolled midnight, you opened the door, just in case someone wanted to join. It began, like so many things, in the old Celtic lands. People believed that on Samhain, their ancestors returned for one night to check on the living. The least you could do was offer them dinner. Hospitality didn't end at the grave. So they laid out a meal, left a chair empty, and kept their voices low. Not out of fear, out of respect. Because if your grandmother's ghost was dropping by, you didn't want to greet her by complaining about the price of oats. In time, the custom spread across Europe. In France, they called it le repas des morts. In Spain, la cena silenciosa. In England, the silent supper or soul night. Different names, same idea. One night a year when the living remembered that love doesn't stop just because someone's heartbeat did. But make no mistake, this wasn't some morbid seance with floating chairs. It was tender, earthy, and deeply human. Families cooked by candlelight. The smell of bread and broth filled small stone cottages. Children helped lay out the table, wide-eyed and solemn, trying not to giggle when their parents shushed them. A candle stood at each place, and if one guttered suddenly, it was said that the spirit had taken its seat. No one looked directly at the empty chair. You didn't want to make the guest uncomfortable. Some families ate after the dead had finished. Others simply left the food untouched until dawn, when it was taken outside for the birds, the foxes, or the wind. The belief was simple. If you fed the world would feed you back. The church for once didn't entirely object. Praying for the dead was good. Feeding them, less so. But as long as no one started chanting in Latin backwards, priests mostly turned a blind eye. Still, you can imagine their discomfort. A quiet village glowing with candlelight. every home filled with silent figures at a table, all of them waiting for invisible guests. There's a record from a 14th century monk in York who wrote that on All Hallows' Eve, the people set tables for the departed, and none dare speak for fear the air itself may listen. He thought it was superstition, but reading it now, it sounds like reverence. The Dumb Supper wasn't just about ghosts, it was about grief, about the aching need to believe that the ones you loved might still be close enough to smell the soup simmering on the fire. Even centuries later, the ritual survived in small ways. In Poland, families still set extra plates on All Souls' Night. In Italy, bakers make little cookies shaped like bones, sweet and crumbly, meant to be shared with the spirits. And in the Scottish Highlands, people leave a loaf of oat bread by the hearth for the unseen visitor who still loves the warmth. The magic of it lies in its simplicity. No spells, no incense, no theatrics. Just an open chair, a flickering flame, and the quiet hope that love is louder than death. Imagine sitting there centuries ago, the room dim, the fire whispering, the candlelight trembling across wooden plates. You breathe slowly. You listen to the house settle, to the faint tap of branches on the shutters, to the stillness that feels almost alive. And for a moment, just a breath, you feel it. That presence that isn't frightening, only familiar. A warmth that moves through the room like a memory that refuses to fade. That's what the Dumb Supper gave people. Permission to feel what they already knew. That grief doesn't end. It changes shape. It becomes bread and light and silence. By dawn, the candles would burn out. The untouched food would be carried to the fields or left for strangers. Children would finally laugh again. And the parents, bleary-eyed but calm, would say, "They came. They always do." Because for all its ghosts and shadows, Halloween was never just about the dead. It was about belonging to a world where every soul, living or gone, could still find its way home for supper. If medieval Europe had social media, it wouldn't have been run by people. It would have been run by birds. Because back then, every flutter of wings was a headline. Every hoot was a warning, and every crow sitting on a fence was basically the town's grim little news anchor. The night birds especially, owls, ravens, crows, they weren't just animals. They were omens, messengers, tiny feathered middle managers between this world and whatever waited after it. And on Halloween night, or All Hallows' Eve, as Europe knew it, those messengers got busy. In the medieval imagination, everything in nature meant something. If the wind howled, angels were fighting. If your candle flickered, a ghost had sneezed. And if an owl hooted 3 times outside your window, well, congratulations. You'd just been CC'd on a message from the other side. Owls in particular were the celebrities of superstition. Silent wings, big eyes, the kind of face that looked like it knew gossip about you from 2 reincarnations ago. Of course, people found them suspicious. The Romans had called them strix, birds of ill omen that drank the blood of infants, which, to be fair, is terrible PR. That story nested its way through the centuries until the owl became Europe's most misunderstood night shift employee. If one perched on your roof, people said it was counting the days until someone inside died. If it flew over a churchyard, it was guiding souls. If it hooted during a wedding, the marriage was doomed, though statistically, so were half of them anyway. And yet, despite all the fear, people kept watching them, half terrified, half enchanted. Because if the owl was a messenger, maybe it could deliver good news too. In rural England, some believed that an owl hooting near the house meant a newborn soul had just arrived, a quiet balancing act between death and life. In Ireland, it meant the fairies were traveling. In France, it meant a storm was coming. And in Germany, if you imitated the owl's call and it answered back, you'd have good luck, or a conversation you'd regret forever. Then there were the ravens and crows, the loudmouths of the underworld. Unlike the silent owl, they announced themselves like politicians in a tavern. They were scavengers, yes, but that only made them seem closer to death. If a raven circled above your field, people said it was sniffing out a soul ready to leave. If it followed you, you were doomed. If it stared at you, and ravens are excellent starers, you owed it respect, or at least a shiny object. And woe betide anyone who ignored them. There's a legend from Wales of a farmer who threw stones at a raven nesting on his roof. That night, his fire went out, and his cow died. The next morning, the raven was back, sitting smugly on the chimney, looking like it had just won an argument on the internet. But not all bird lore was so gloomy. Sometimes superstition was just the old world's way of explaining how alive everything was. Birds didn't predict death. They reminded people that the world noticed, that the air, the trees, and the creatures in them were all participants in whatever strange conversation humans called existence. During the harvest, when the fields emptied and silence returned, the cry of a single crow or the flutter of an owl's wings became music. Eerie, yes, but comforting. Because in those sounds, you could still hear movement, still feel connection, even as the nights grew long and the fires burned low. The church tried, of course, to untangle bird superstition from faith. They preached that only angels carried divine messages, not animals. But the villagers just nodded politely, then went home and left breadcrumbs on the windowsill for the ravens, just in case the angels got hungry. Even monks couldn't resist the symbolism. In illuminated manuscripts, owls often lurk in the corners, their round eyes staring at saints as if to say, "You may have holy wisdom, but I can see in the dark." Ravens, meanwhile, perched beside prophets and hermits, forever tied to the idea of knowledge that comes at a cost. The birds of death had become birds of wisdom, a rebrand that would have made any medieval PR team proud. Halloween, of course, magnified. All of it. When the fires blazed and the dead were said to walk, the sound of wings overhead made even the bravest pause. Some villagers threw salt into the air to ward off spirit birds. Others simply listened to the caws, the hoots, the soft rush of feathers through the night, and felt strangely less alone. Because maybe the birds weren't warning anyone. Maybe they were just witnesses. Even now, their superstition lingers. We still say a raven at the Tower of London holds the fate of the kingdom. We still think an owl's call feels like an echo from somewhere ancient and knowing. And when we see a crow perched on a lamppost on a gray October evening, some small, quiet part of us still thinks someone's listening. So if you hear one tonight, an owl in the trees, a raven overhead, a crow on your roof, don't shoo it away. Just nod. It's only passing along the same message it's carried for 1,000 years, that the world is never truly silent, and the living are never truly alone. If you lived in medieval Europe, you wouldn't build a house without a blessing, and preferably a bone or two. It wasn't that people were morbid, they were practical. They knew the world was unpredictable. One bad winter, one fire, one particularly judgmental priest, and your luck could collapse faster than your thatched roof. So, to keep evil out and good fortune in, they built their beliefs right into the walls. Literally. Archaeologists have found bones buried under doorways, inside hearths, even tucked beneath floorboards, relics of a time when superstition and construction went hand in hand. To us, it sounds eerie. To them, it was just sound architecture with spiritual insulation. The idea was simple. If you gave the spirits a place to live, they wouldn't need to bother you. Every threshold was a border between inside and outside, safety and risk, the living and whoever else might drop by unannounced. And medieval people respected borders. So when you built a house, you didn't just hammer wood and stone. You negotiated with the invisible. In England, they buried chicken bones under thresholds, a small meal for any passing ghost. In Ireland, it was cat bones, for luck and to keep vermin, both literal and spiritual, away. In Germany and the Low Countries, it was animal skulls, cows, goats, even horses, hidden behind walls to guard the house. There's one farm in Bavaria where archaeologists uncovered an entire cow's head sealed into a foundation stone. The skull was painted with ochre and carved with a crude cross. Whoever built that home clearly thought, let's just cover every base. Bones were protection, but also memory. People believed that the essence of life lingered in what remained of it. If you placed a bone beneath your home, it acted like a charm, a guardian that could see what you couldn't. And Halloween, the night of thin boundaries, was when those guardians were thought to wake up. You could hear them, they said, creaking in the timbers, settling in the walls, not haunting, just stretching, like the house itself was alive, remembering everyone who'd ever lived within it. Some households added extra precautions on All Hallows' Eve. They'd sprinkle salt by the doors, hang sprigs of rosemary from rafters, or place iron scissors in the shape of a cross under a child's pillow. The iron was said to cut through dark forces. The rosemary, well, it just smelled nice and made the demons hungry. In France, bones weren't just buried, they were built with. In Paris, ossuaries filled entire cathedrals and crypts. The most famous, of course, is the catacombs, tunnels lined with skulls, stacked neatly like grim wallpaper. By the late Middle Ages, Paris had so many bodies and so little ground that the living and dead began sharing walls. And while today we find that unsettling medieval Parisians thought it was poetic. Why fear death? One 15th century writer asked, when you live inside it. It wasn't just big cities, though. Rural churches across Europe quietly collected bones too, sometimes under the altar, sometimes beneath the floor. Farmers would donate a loved one's remains to the church, believing that resting close to God's house would keep their souls warm through eternity. Even homes had miniature versions of this practice. If you renovated your cottage, you might find a small bundle of bones tied with string inside the wall. You wouldn't remove it, not unless you wanted bad luck or a draft. You'd patch over it carefully, maybe whisper a prayer, and let it keep doing its job. Because bones weren't symbols of decay, they were continuity, proof that the world, no matter how fragile, held together through memory. And that belief bled into Halloween itself. The night was full of bones, carved into bread, pan dei morti in Italy, painted on church doors, worn as charms around the neck. Children played games with animal knuckle bones, tossing them for luck. And in some towns, people carried real skeletons in candlelit processions, chanting, "As we are now, so you shall be." It wasn't meant to terrify. It was a reminder, gentle, matter-of-fact, and maybe a little smug, that life and death weren't enemies. They were neighbors sharing a fence. Imagine it, a crooked timber house, its walls humming softly in the October wind. A family sits by the fire, the smell of smoke and bread in the air. Outside, the leaves scrape across the stones, a hollow sound like laughter through teeth. The children ask why their father left a skull under the door. He smiles and says, "So the wind knows we already have company." In that world, fear and comfort were the same thing. You didn't banish the dark, you invited it to dinner and gave it a chair. And maybe, in some strange way, that's what Halloween has always been. About making peace with what's beneath us, inside us, and waiting patiently under every door. Because the bones aren't warning us. They're whispering what every generation eventually learns, that the past never leaves. It just becomes the foundation we build on. If there was one thing medieval Europe could agree on, it was that religion was important, and that beer made everything easier to understand. By the time Christianity had woven itself through the continent like ivy through stone, the bonfires of Samhain were still burning. They'd just received a few upgrades, a splash of holy water, a priest who insisted on supervising, and probably a choir that sang slightly off-key. The church had learned by now that trying to ban the old fire festivals was as effective as banning weather. So it did what the church did best. It baptized them. The pagan fires of the harvest became Hallowtide vigils. The offerings to spirits became prayers for souls. And the barrels of ale, once meant to toast the gods of fertility, were now officially for community fellowship, which is, incidentally, how you rebrand drinking as a sacrament. In England, villagers gathered on All Hallows' Eve around what were called soul fires, towering pyres that were supposedly meant to burn away sin. But everyone knew they were really just the same old bonfires, only with a bishop's blessing and slightly better snacks. In the Germanic lands, the fires were called Seelenfeuer, and they were said to keep wandering spirits warm as they crossed the fields. People carried torches from those sacred flames back to their homes, lighting their hearths anew. By morning, the valley would look like a constellation fallen to earth, 1,000 small fires glowing where families had taken their share of the light. And, of course, there was music. The Middle Ages loved a good contradiction. Prayer that sounded suspiciously like partying. Monks sang hymns while peasants danced to fiddles. A priest would bless the ale barrel. Someone would trip over it 5 minutes later, and everyone agreed it was divine intervention. One 14th century bishop complained that the people do not fear death on All Hallows, but rejoice as though at a wedding. He wasn't wrong. For many, Halloween had become less about the dead and more about defying them. A festival that said, "We remember you, but we're still here." There was something beautiful about that. The fire symbolized not just purity, but persistence. After months of labor and fear and superstition, the light was proof that humanity hadn't gone out yet. And beer. Well, beer helped keep that optimism burning. In Ireland, people brewed a dark, smoky ale for the occasion, sometimes flavored with honey or heather. In Bavaria, it was Allerseelenbier, a malty beer dedicated to the souls in purgatory. Each household brewed a little, drank a little, and offered a mug to the dead, because what's an afterlife without a proper toast? In France, families brought mugs of cider or wine to the churchyard and poured a few drops onto the graves of loved ones. The sound of liquid on stone was like a blessing you could hear. Even in the cloisters, where silence was supposed to reign, monks bent the rules. Some abbeys kept a single fire burning all night in the courtyard, its glow falling across the stone arches. The brothers gathered around it, chanting softly, not in Latin, but in the old vernacular hymns of their childhood. For that one night, faith felt less like doctrine and more like memory. And everywhere, there was laughter, because medieval Europe, for all its plagues and wars and confessions, understood something we often forget. You can't be solemn forever. Even the dead wouldn't want that. There's a folk song from 15th century Normandy that captures the mood perfectly. It begins as a hymn, slow, reverent, almost mournful, and then, halfway through, the rhythm shifts. Drums join in, fiddles follow, and the singer cries out, "Raise up your glass, for saints and for sinners, for all who still dance while the fire burns." It wasn't blasphemy, it was gratitude, a celebration of survival, of making it through another harvest, another year, another long dark season. By the 1500s, these hybrid festivities had become the heart of Halloween across Europe. Some towns held processions that began with church prayers and ended with impromptu bonfire dances. Others hosted soul feasts, where everyone brought a dish, a candle, and at least one story about a departed relative, preferably one involving bad behavior. The night belonged to everyone, the pious and the drunk, the fearful and the free, the monks who rang bells for the dead and the villagers who toasted to them anyway. The church never fully won that battle, but neither did the pagans. Instead, they did what Europe always did best, compromise. And so, under 1,000 different skies, on the last night of October, The fires still burned, glowing orange against the wind, reflecting in mugs of ale, warming faces and hearts alike. Somewhere between sin and salvation, laughter and prayer, Halloween became what it had always secretly been, a night to honor both heaven and humanity. When the fires died down, people carried home their embers again, small, warm tokens of a night that belonged to everyone. The sparks rose into the dark, trailing smoke and song, and for a few beautiful moments, even the stars looked like they were burning beer-colored light. If you'd been a love-struck teenager in medieval Europe, Halloween wasn't just a night for ghosts, it was a night for answers. Not the kind of answers found in church, but the kind whispered by candles and mirrors, by water bowls and apple skins and nervous laughter. Because long before tarot cards or dating apps, there was Halloween divination. And if the dead were willing to cross over that night, well, surely they could deliver a few romantic spoilers along the way. It began innocently enough. Young women, told they'd have little say in who they married, found comfort in rituals that promised a peek at fate. If the veil between worlds was thin, maybe they could catch a glimpse through it, not of ghosts, but of grooms. So they turned their kitchens and hearths into laboratories of superstition. Apples were peeled in one long curl and tossed over a shoulder. The shape it made on the ground would reveal the initial of your future husband. Nuts were thrown into the fire 2 at a time. If they burned together, the match would be loving. If they popped apart, best to start lowering your expectations early. In Scotland, they filled bowls with water, dropped in apple slices, and took turns trying to catch them with their teeth, not just for fun, but to prove who had the most luck, and apparently the least dignity. Those who succeeded were said to marry soonest. Those who didn't were probably destined for a career in witchcraft or cats. Then came the mirrors. Oh, the mirrors. If there's one thing you should never do on a night when spirits are known to wander, it's stare into reflective surfaces by candlelight. And yet, medieval Europe was obsessed with doing exactly that. Girls would stand alone in darkened rooms, holding a single candle and a small mirror, whispering, "Let me see my true love's face." If the reflection shimmered, it meant their future spouse was near. If it stayed still, they were to remain single. If a skull appeared, well, that was self-explanatory, and frankly, bad for morale. One English folktale tells of a girl who tried this ritual on All Hallows' Eve and saw not one face, but 2, hers, and a shadowed one behind her. She married the man she thought she saw, only for him to die a year later. The villagers said it wasn't tragedy, just accurate scheduling. Even so, the practice spread. In Ireland, mirrors were replaced with bowls of water, where candlelight flickered like liquid moons. In France, they poured molten lead into cold water and read the hardened shapes as omens: a heart for love, a ring for marriage, a coffin for perhaps next time. And in parts of Eastern Europe, young women placed 9 mirrors in a circle, sat inside with a candle, and waited for visions of the one who will come. It's unclear whether any husbands ever arrived, but the mirrors certainly enjoyed the attention. Men, meanwhile, had their own less elegant customs. In England, bachelors baked cakes with charms hidden inside: a coin for wealth, a ring for marriage, a button for bachelorhood. Whoever got the ring was said to wed within the year. Whoever got the button, well, at least they didn't choke. Across Europe, these games blurred the line between love spell and party trick. But beneath the laughter was something earnest, a quiet hunger for control in a world that offered little. The same way bonfires kept away the dark, these small rituals kept away despair. And there was something poetic about it, the idea that love, like the dead, might cross over on Halloween night. Even the church couldn't stamp it out. Priests grumbled, of course. One 15th century sermon warned that maidens who gaze in mirrors invite the devil to dance beside them. Yet, even nuns were caught playing apple games in convent kitchens. Saints, it turns out, have social lives too. Halloween became the unofficial holiday of what if. What if the face in the mirror smiled back? What if the apple peel spelled your name and his? What if fate was listening just this once? Those small questions, half serious, half silly, made the night shimmer with possibility. It wasn't about certainty. It was about hope, wrapped in superstition, lit by candlelight and teenage curiosity. Even now, echoes of those rituals remain, bobbing for apples, fortune-telling games at parties, love spelled out in cards or stars or pumpkin seeds, all modern masks for the same ancient desire, to believe that on this one enchanted night, the universe might lean down, whisper a secret, and let you peek at the life waiting just beyond the dark. And maybe that's the truest magic of all, not spells or ghosts or flames, but the courage to look into the mirror, see both shadow and light, and believe that somewhere between them, your future is smiling back. There were stories in medieval Europe that people whispered only when the wind was right, when the fires were low and the bells had stopped. Stories about nights when the sky itself seemed to move. They called it the Wild Hunt, sometimes the Furious Host, sometimes the Silent Procession. Different names, same dread. A ghostly army that rode through the air on stormy nights, sweeping up lost souls and foolish travelers who stayed out too late. If you heard hooves in the wind, you dropped to your knees. If you saw lights in the clouds, you shut your eyes. And if the howling passed right over your roof, you whispered a prayer and promised to behave better next year. The Wild Hunt wasn't just one legend, it was a chorus of them. In Scandinavia, it was Odin leading the dead to battle. In Germany, it was King Wotan, or sometimes a spectral woman named Frau Holda, riding with a pack of ghostly hounds. In Britain, it was Herne the hunter, crowned with antlers, galloping through Windsor Forest. And in France, it was the Chasse Fantastique, a stampede of lost spirits chasing shadows they'd never catch. Different languages, same fear, that the sky could come alive. No one knew when the hunt would appear, but everyone knew what it meant: imbalance. Too many unburied dead, too many broken vows, too much noise from the living world. It was the universe's way of clearing its throat. And Halloween, the night when worlds overlapped, was prime time for the host's arrival. The chronicles are full of eerie details. A 12th century monk in Normandy wrote of riders seen against the moon, their eyes like embers, their hounds crying as if for souls. A farmer in Saxony claimed he found hoofprints burned into the frost after a storm, each print filled with ashes that never cooled. In Wales, people said they heard the clatter of armor above the clouds, followed by a sound like laughter swallowed by wind. But not all who saw it were afraid. Some said the hunt was a cleansing force, carrying away the restless dead so they wouldn't trouble the living. Others claimed to see loved ones among the riders, pale, calm, and free at last. It wasn't death they feared, but being left behind. Still, the wise stayed indoors. On All Hallows' Eve, families shuttered windows, banked fires, and left a bit of bread on the doorstep, so the riders may pass by full and satisfied. If the hounds came sniffing, it was bad luck to shoo them away. Better to toss them a crust and say, "Ride on." Sometimes, though, curiosity won. In a German tale from the Rhineland, a young blacksmith stayed out after dark, hoping to catch sight of the hunt. He hid beneath a tree and waited. When the wind began to howl, he saw a pale figure gallop past, not on a horse, but on a beam of light. Behind it came hundreds more, cloaked and silent, their faces shifting like smoke. The blacksmith was found the next morning, alive, but white-haired. When asked what he'd seen, he only said, "They weren't hunting me, not yet." Even the church couldn't quite decide what to make of the legend. Some priests called it a vision of purgatory, the souls of the unshriven doing penance across the sky. Others said it was the devil's parade, tempting mortals to look up when they should be praying down. But the people, as always, found their own explanation. The hunt was balance, a reminder that the world above and the world below both had traffic, and you'd better stay in your lane. Over time, the story softened. The furious riders became the silent host, not an army, but a procession. In later versions, they carried candles instead of swords. They moved quietly through the clouds, their glow like lanterns adrift in mist. The living who saw them didn't hide. They watched, reverent and still. It was said that if you kept your heart pure, you might hear them singing. No words, just a melody that made you forget where you were. Even now, on stormy autumn nights in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, people still talk about strange sounds in the wind, like hooves or drums, or the low hum of 1,000 voices moving somewhere just above the treetops. If you ask what it is, they'll shrug and say, only the old ones riding. Maybe that's why Halloween has always felt both thrilling and calm. The fear wrapped in familiarity, because deep down, we all like the idea that someone, even a ghostly host, is still out there keeping the world in rhythm. So if you're ever walking on a windy night and the trees start to sway and the air feels like it's humming through your bones, don't be afraid. Step aside, bow your head, and listen. You might just hear the silent host passing by, riders on invisible horses carrying the sound of the past through the sky, reminding the living to keep moving and to always leave a little light burning for those still on the road. If ghosts had travel guides, medieval Europe would have been their dream destination. Crumbling castles? Check. Foggy forests? Plenty. Church crypts? Forgotten tunnels? And the occasional noble who'd been buried twice just to be safe? Oh yes, paradise. For the living, though, these places were less haunted mansion and more mandatory anxiety. Because in the Middle Ages, death wasn't a rare event, it was a neighbor. And every stone seemed to have a story about who used to stand beside it. Castles, in particular, were like luxury hotels for restless spirits. They had everything a ghost could want: echoing halls, drafts for dramatic entrances, and a steady rotation of tragic residents. Every fortress from Ireland to Austria had at least one story of a lady in white. A spectral noblewoman drifting through corridors, waiting for a husband who'd gone crusading and forgotten to come back. Sometimes she was mourning, sometimes she was warning, and sometimes, if we're honest, she was just a little bored. The White Lady of Hohenzollern Castle in Germany, for instance, was said to appear before deaths in the royal family, gliding silently through the stone halls, her gown glowing faintly like moonlight on marble. In Scotland, the Green Lady of Vivey Castle wept in an unused tower, her sobs echoing whenever someone dared to renovate. Even ghosts, apparently, hate construction noise. But it wasn't just nobles who lingered. The servants, the soldiers, the masons who'd built those fortresses, they haunted too. In Wales, there's the story of a castle cook who died in a kitchen fire and now walks through the ruins smelling of smoke and stew. People still leave him small offerings of bread because honestly, if you're haunting a place and still hungry, that's just tragic. Beneath the castles lay another kind of memory, the catacombs. In cities like Paris, Rome, and Naples, entire labyrinths of bones stretched beneath the cobblestones, stacked neatly like grim bookshelves. They were called charnel houses, and they weren't morbid to medieval people. They were comforting. The dead weren't gone. They were just reorganized. By candlelight, priests and monks would walk through those tunnels, whispering prayers that echoed off the skulls. The wax smoke curled through the air, settling on hollow eye sockets like a benediction. They said, If you touched the bones with respect, they would warm under your hand, a sign that the soul within remembered your kindness. Pilgrims came from miles away to see these underground sanctuaries. Some brought candles shaped like human figures, one to burn for every friend they'd lost. Imagine the flickering glow of hundreds of little flames illuminating row after row of skulls, the air heavy with incense and the slow drip of wax. Above ground, the castles stood cold and proud. Below, the catacombs breathed, quiet, endless, patient. Even smaller villages had their own version of catacombs. In England and France, bones that had outlasted their graves were stacked in crypts beneath churches. The locals called them bone houses, and visiting them was part of the All Hallows season. Families went down with candles, not in fear, but gratitude. They'd light a wick, whisper a prayer, and leave it to burn among the skulls, a nightlight for eternity. The air was thick with the scent of wax and limestone. Sometimes the candles guttered, and everyone went silent, because a dying flame meant a soul had been released, or, depending on who you asked, that the draft was terrible. The strange thing is how peaceful it all was. In a world we imagine as grim and fearful, medieval people found beauty in decay. The same candle that lit a castle hall also burned in the catacombs below, linking the feast of the living to the rest of the family waiting quietly in stone. It's easy to see why Halloween flourished in that world. The line between grandeur and grave was so thin, you could walk through it carrying nothing more than a candle. Picture it, a foggy night over an old fortress, windows glowing like watchful eyes. Inside, the nobility feast in candlelight, while, deep beneath their feet, the catacombs shimmer faintly with their own small constellations of flame. The same smoke rises through the cracks, curling through hallways, blurring the air until even the living look a little translucent. That was medieval Europe, a place that believed memory had weight, that love could linger in stone, and that a candle's flame, no matter how small, could burn bright enough to keep the darkness civilized. So when the wind rattled the shutters and the fires burned low, people didn't run from these haunted places. They leaned closer to the light. They whispered, "Stay a while." Because castles crumble, bones turn to dust, but candle smoke, that drifts forever. If the ghosts of medieval Europe had been watching the living, they probably would have rolled their spectral eyes every autumn, because when it came to Halloween, people were far more interested in fruit than phantoms. By late October, apples were everywhere. Red, gold, green, polished, perfumed, and packed into baskets that smelled like the season itself. They were the sweet proof that summer had done its job and that the world wasn't finished feeding you yet. And so, the weeks when the veil between worlds grew thin, the people of Europe invented a simple, charming, and slightly ridiculous way to celebrate survival. They played with their food. The humble apple became the centerpiece of Halloween mischief and magic alike. In the Scottish Highlands, girls would peel them in a single, unbroken curl and toss the ribbon of skin over their shoulder. The letter it formed on the ground was said to be the initial of their future husband. If the peel broke mid-air, that meant a life of independence, which frankly sounds like the better deal. In Ireland, apples floated in buckets of water, waiting for brave souls to plunge their faces in pursuit of them, an act now known as bobbing for apples. It was messy, competitive, and oddly spiritual. Each apple represented luck, and whoever caught one in their teeth first would enjoy good fortune and mild neck pain for the rest of the year. Across England, the game was called Duck Apple Night. Families placed a basin in the middle of the room, lit candles around it, and took turns trying their luck. The result was usually laughter, wet hair, and the faint smell of extinguished candles, a sensory cocktail that still feels like autumn. But apples weren't just playthings. They were symbols. To medieval minds, the apple was the fruit of knowledge, love, and fate, all the things that made being human so complicated. When the year turned cold and everything else died, apples endured. They hung stubbornly from branches or rested in cellars like little suns in hibernation. To bite into one in October was to remember warmth and hope that it would return. So, naturally, people started using them for magic. In parts of France, apples were sliced crosswise to reveal the five-pointed star hidden inside, a natural pentagram, which they called the Star of the Seed. They believed this symbol kept witches and misfortune away. Ironically, witches believed the same thing, so everyone agreed on the apple's usefulness for entirely different reasons. In Germany, families hung apples over doorways during harvest festivals. Each apple represented a blessing: health, fertility, fortune, forgiveness. If it fell and rolled toward the door, the blessing would travel outward to friends. If it rolled inward, it meant the family needed to make peace with someone, or perhaps just that they needed to sweep. There were also the charm games, delightful little acts of low-stakes fortune-telling that combined superstition with socializing. Young people would place apples and nuts on the hearth. If the apples roasted quietly, true love would be faithful. If they hissed or burst, well, there was your omen. The line between prayer and prank was always deliciously thin. And then there was Snap-Apple, which was arguably the medieval version of extreme sports. Imagine a string stretched across the room with apples dangling from it, spinning wildly. Now, imagine trying to bite one while keeping your hands behind your back, all while your friends laughed and the candle flames danced dangerously close to your hair. It's amazing how many romantic customs from this period began as low-key, near-death experiences. But the spirit of it all was joy, simple, playful defiance against the coming winter. After months of labor and fear and superstition, people needed laughter. The apple gave them that, an excuse to gather, to tease, to flirt, to taste sweetness before the frost returned. And beneath the laughter was something older, something tender. Apples, like candles, were offerings, gifts for both the living and the dead. In Ireland and Brittany, people left apples on windowsills for visiting spirits, saying, "For those who have no orchards where they've gone." In Poland, apples were buried with the deceased to feed them on their journey. Even the simplest act, polishing an apple and setting it by the fire, was a gesture of remembrance. It's funny, really, how much one fruit could mean: life and death, love and loss, games and goodbyes. Imagine a small stone cottage on All Hallows' Eve. The fire crackles. A bucket of water sits gleaming in the candlelight. Laughter echoes as someone leans too far and splashes half the floor. Outside, the wind sighs through the apple trees, bare now, their branches bending like old hands waving farewell to the year. The smell of cider drifts through the air. A candle flickers by the window. And in the quiet after the laughter, you realize that these games, these tiny rituals of sweetness, were never just for fun. They were reminders that joy is also a form of prayer, and that maybe, just maybe, the best way to honor the dead is to keep biting into life, even when it's cold, and the orchard's gone to sleep. If you had walked through a medieval marketplace on an autumn afternoon, you might have thought you'd stumbled into a very fashionable seance. Every stall sold protection, not charms or amulets exactly, though there were plenty of those, but things you could wear, sew, or hide in your pocket that promised to keep you safe from everything from frost to fate. Because in medieval Europe, clothing wasn't just what you wore. It was your armor against the invisible. The world back then felt unpredictable, and people loved to weave meaning into anything they could hold. So they spun their fears into thread, stitched hope into seams, and wrapped themselves in quiet prayers disguised as fabric. Linen shirts were embroidered with tiny crosses near the collar, to protect the throat from sickness, or from whatever liked to whisper there at night. Red thread was tied around infants' wrists to ward off the evil eye, and sailors stitched bits of seaweed into their cuffs, believing it would guide them home. Even the colors carried superstition. White was for purity and for funerals. Black was for mourning, but also for mystery, a shade that said, I respect the dark, but it doesn't own me. Green was lucky, unless you were getting married in it, in which case it was cursed. There's probably a long story there involving grass stains and regret. But autumn, especially around All Hallows' Eve, was when fabric took on extra duties. People believed that the boundary between worlds wasn't just in the air, it clung to you. So you had to be careful what you wore when the veil grew thin. In Ireland and Scotland, villagers would weave new shawls before Halloween, not for warmth, but for warding. They used wool spun on the last day of harvest, blessed it with smoke from the bonfire, and wrapped it around their shoulders before going outside. They said that if a spirit brushed past you, the smoke-woven cloth would confuse it. It would think you were already halfway to the other side. The church disapproved, of course. One 15th century priest in Yorkshire wrote angrily that women do enchant their garments and mutter into cloth as pagans do. But even he admitted that he'd rather see them wearing blessed shawls than go bare against the devilish wind, which is about as close as medieval theology got to compromise. And then there were charms sewn into seams, little pockets of power, bits of herbs, snippets of scripture, coins, teeth, even the occasional frog bone. Don't ask. Tailors knew how to hide them well. You'd never see the stitches, but you'd feel the difference. A strange comfort, like carrying your grandmother's handkerchief or a lucky penny. These charms weren't about rebellion. They were about balance. A quiet acknowledgement that faith and fear could coexist, that a prayer and a superstition were sometimes the same thread pulled through different needles. At Halloween, when people disguised themselves as spirits, these protective stitches were like invisible armor. A red thread in a sleeve could keep the dead from following you home. A sprig of rue sewn into a hem made sure no ghost could tug at it. And a silver button at the throat, well, that was just good fashion and good sense. In parts of Eastern Europe, families wove strips of linen and tied them to fences or trees outside their homes. Each strip represented a name, a loved one who had died. When the wind blew, the fluttering fabric was said to let the souls visit, wrapping the air around them like an embrace. It was a textile form of prayer, soft, personal, and strangely moving. Even the dying were wrapped with care. Linen shrouds were not plain cloth, but stitched with symbols, crosses, flowers, stars, each one a farewell in thread. To the medieval mind, every stitch was a word, every knot a promise. And those promises, they believed, might be what kept the soul warm on its journey through the dark. Imagine a small cottage on an October night. The fire glows low, the room smelling faintly of wool and peat. A mother sits by the hearth, mending a sleeve. Her needle moves in rhythm, in, out, through, pull, like breathing. She hums softly, not quite a song, not quite a prayer. When she finishes, she ties off the thread, kisses it once, and snips it clean. To anyone else, it's a simple act of sewing. To her, it's a blessing. Because in that world, superstition was just love, expressed in practical form. A mother couldn't guard her child from every shadow. A farmer couldn't control the harvest. A sailor couldn't command the sea. But they could weave their worry into something tangible. A shawl, a cuff, a stitch. A promise that, whatever haunted the night, they would meet it, dressed for the occasion. So next time you pull on a sweater on a cold October evening, think of those medieval hands, spinning, sewing, whispering their hopes into every fiber. Because maybe protection isn't magic at all. Maybe it's just the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, once tied a red thread in your name and believed it would hold. For centuries, the sound of bells had kept Europe's nights in rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer, warning of storms, marking births, and bidding farewell to the dead. They were the heartbeat of villages, the voice of the divine, and the one sound you could hear no matter where you stood. But then came the years when the bells fell quiet. It wasn't war that silenced them, not at first. It was fear. The 14th century was an age of unrelenting uncertainty. Famine had emptied fields, floods had swallowed towns, and plague had taken half the continent's breath. And when the Black Death swept through Europe, the bells, those solemn, comforting sounds of community, became unbearable, because for every death, they tolled. And when entire parishes died, there were no hands left to ring them. Chroniclers wrote that some towns fell into a silence so complete it felt like the air itself had died. The church towers stood tall, the ropes swaying gently in the wind, but no sound came. The people said the bells were mourning too. Halloween, or what remained of it, changed in those years. The bonfires burned lower, the laughter dimmed. Even the songs sung for the dead became softer, more like sighs than hymns. No one dared to mock the spirits anymore. There were too many of them. In England, families began lighting candles instead, one for each soul lost that year. The candlelight flickered against shuttered windows like trembling ghosts, a quiet rebellion against despair. In Italy, mourners wore black veils embroidered with silver crosses, walking the streets in silence. In Germany, people set out bowls of water and bread, not as offerings to the ancestors, but for the newly departed neighbors they hadn't had time to bury. The bells, when they did ring again, rang differently, slower, hollow somehow, as though the sound itself carried memory. But even in grief, humans are stubborn creatures. We can't live in silence forever. So when the plague passed and the fields began to breathe again, people did what they always did. They found new ways to make the darkness bearable. The Halloween that followed the Great Silence became something new. It was quieter, yes, but more intimate. A night of remembrance, rather than revelry. The bells, when they finally returned to life, were part of it. Monks in France began tolling a single, low bell at midnight on All Hallows' Eve, not for fear, but for peace. They called it the Soul's Bell. Each note was meant to guide one wandering spirit home. In England, they revived an older custom called soul massing. Villagers gathered outside the church with lanterns, walking slowly around the graveyard as the bell tolled. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of feet on frosted grass and that deep rhythmic bell, a sound that seemed to echo from the earth itself. Children, too, joined in. They carried small handbells called tinklers, ringing them softly at doorways and reciting verses for bread or coins. It was part charity, part ritual, and part healing, a way to remind the living that life still continued, one soft sound at a time. And then came the silence again, this time not from plague, but from war. When armies marched through villages, they melted the bells for cannon metal. The same bronze that once sang of love and loss now fired through the air in anger. It must have felt like the sky was turning on itself. Yet even without them, the people remembered their rhythm. They hummed the old tones, beat the cadence on tabletops, and sang the melodies that had once been carried by bronze. They kept the sound alive in memory. That's the thing about bells. Even when you can't hear them, you feel them. The vibrations stay in your bones. So when peace returned, the first thing many towns did wasn't rebuild walls or markets. It was hang new bells. They lifted them high into towers with ropes and pulleys, and when they rang for the first time, people wept. They said it sounded like forgiveness. By then, Halloween had fully changed. It was no longer about scaring away spirits. It was about remembering how to live beside them. The bells no longer warned or mourned. They comforted. They told the living, "You've made it through another year. Light your candles. The world still sings." Imagine it now, a small stone church on an October night, mist curling low over the fields. The bell tower stands against the moonlight, and a single note rolls across the valley. It doesn't frighten you. It settles in your chest like a heartbeat you'd forgotten you had. And below, in the cottages, people pause their work and listen, just for a moment, because that sound, once lost, is proof that silence never wins forever. The bells may have gone quiet, but they never stopped ringing. Not really. They were just waiting for the world to be ready to listen again. Before pumpkins became the orange ambassadors of Halloween, Europe carved something far less glamorous, and, depending on who you ask, far more disturbing. Because before America had its cheerful jack-o'-lanterns, Europe had turnips. Yes, turnips. The vegetable that looks like a potato trying to be a ghost. They were small, knobbly, and pale. Not exactly easy to carve, but perfect for terrifying anyone walking home in the dark. And they carried a story that was older than Halloween itself, the legend of Stingy Jack. Jack, according to Irish folklore, was a blacksmith with a fondness for drink and a gift for bad decisions. One night, he invited the devil for a pint, and then, somehow, tricked him into paying for it. When death finally came for Jack years later, heaven refused him, on account of his life choices, and hell did too, on account of the devil's pride. So Jack was left to wander the earth forever, carrying only a hollowed turnip with a burning coal inside to light his way. They called him Jack of the Lantern. The story spread like wildfire, from Irish hearths to Scottish hills, from Welsh cottages to English taverns. By the 16th century, carving a lighted turnip on Halloween wasn't just tradition, it was necessity. The lanterns were said to keep wandering souls away, or at least distract Jack long enough for you to make it home. Of course, practicality wasn't Europe's strong suit. Turnips are solid, stubborn little roots. Carving one feels like chiseling through wood with a spoon. But that didn't stop anyone. Families sat around their tables with knives and candles, scraping and hollowing until their turnips glowed from within, pale, grim, and vaguely judgmental. Some had crude faces, others intricate patterns. In Ireland, the lanterns were sometimes shaped like skulls. In England, they had wide, gaping grins. In Germany, they were hung on sticks and carried door to door by children chanting songs for spirit money. And the effect? Utterly terrifying. Imagine walking home on a misty October night, seeing a dim light bobbing through the fog, and then realizing it's a grotesque vegetable face swinging from a stick, held by someone humming about ghosts. It's the kind of thing that would make even a seasoned phantom rethink its schedule. But beyond the spookiness, the turnip lanterns were deeply symbolic. They were the light of memory, a small fire to remind the darkness that life was still here, still stubborn. They guarded doorsteps, guided souls, and made sure the cold season began with a bit of laughter, however nervous. Other countries had their own glowing traditions. In Wales, farmers carved mangel wurzels, giant beets, into lanterns for the harvest feast. In Germany and Switzerland, children celebrated Rebenlichtli, the festival of turnip lights, marching through villages with their carved Imena roots as songs filled the streets. In France, people placed candles inside hollowed gourds and called them courges des morts, the squashes of the dead. The idea was always the same. If you keep a flame alive, you keep hope alive. And then, centuries later, the Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their lantern tradition to America, a new world where turnips were small, but pumpkins were everywhere. It must have felt like a miracle. A vegetable already shaped like a lantern, soft, easy to carve, and dramatically photogenic. Within a generation, pumpkins had completely replaced turnips. They were bigger, brighter, and, crucially, didn't smell like boiled regret when you put a candle inside. And so, the jack-o'-lantern, as we know it, was born. A cheerful cousin of the grim little root that started it all. But even now, in the quiet corners of rural Ireland or the misty Highlands, some families still carve turnips for Halloween. They sit them on their windowsills, gnarled faces glowing faintly through the fog. A nod to the old ways, to the nights when light came hard-earned, when warmth was precious, and when the dead were not feared, only acknowledged. It's strange to think how much of our modern Halloween began with a handful of farmers and some particularly patient knives. How a root pulled from the cold ground became a symbol of remembrance and rebellion, of laughter flickering against the dark. So the next time you carve a pumpkin, think of your European ancestors hunched over their kitchen tables, their fingers stained with soil, their candles trembling in the wind, and their pale, ghostly turnips grinning back at them like tiny warnings or jokes. They didn't call it art, they called it survival. Because every light, no matter how small or silly, is a declaration. We're still here. And we refuse to wander in the dark alone. If you follow the scent of Halloween far enough back through history, it doesn't smell like chocolate or candy corn. It smells like warm bread, honey, and spice. Long before trick-or-treaters roamed the streets with plastic buckets, the people of medieval Europe celebrated the season with something simpler and far more sacred: soul cakes. They were small, round pastries, sweet but humble, baked with nutmeg, cinnamon, and dried fruit. Each one represented a soul. Each bite was a prayer. The custom began in the early Middle Ages as part of All Souls' Day, when the living prayed for the dead to be released from purgatory. But not everyone could afford the luxury of donating candles or paying for masses. So instead, they baked. Families set out trays of soul cakes on their doorsteps. The poor, often children, went from house to house, reciting verses in exchange for one. A soul for a soul cake. Pray, good missus, a soul to take. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who saved us all. It was part prayer, part bargain, part snack, the medieval trifecta, and it made sense in a world where religion and hunger were never far apart. When someone took a cake, they promised to say a prayer for the donor's dead. The idea was simple and beautiful. Feed the living, free the lost. You gave sweetness, and in return, you gained mercy. Children, and eventually mischievous teenagers, began to look forward to this annual pilgrimage of pastries. They were the first trick-or-treaters, centuries before plastic skeletons or fun-sized candy bars ever existed. Except back then, the trick part wasn't mischief, it was theology. If you refused to share, people said the dead might feel neglected, and no one wanted hungry ghosts. In England, the custom was called souling. In Ireland and Scotland, guising. In Wales, going a-souling. Each region added its own flair: lanterns carved from turnips, songs about the afterlife, and sometimes, because this was still Europe, a small mug of ale to warm the spirits. The cakes themselves varied, but their purpose didn't. They were shaped in circles for eternity, crossed with lines for the 4 seasons, and baked in batches big enough to feed half the parish. Some households flavored them with saffron. Others sprinkled sugar on top in the shape of a cross. And when the smell drifted through the streets on cold October evenings, people said it was the scent of heaven visiting for supper. The church didn't object. In fact, it encouraged the practice, a rare moment of alignment between faith and fun. Priests saw souling as an act of charity, a way to feed both body and spirit. It also kept the peasants too busy chewing to commit heresy, which was a win for everyone. But as centuries passed, something shifted. The prayers grew shorter, the songs lighter, the laughter louder. Souling night became less about salvation and more about snacks. By the 17th century, children began performing little plays at doorsteps or telling jokes for extra cakes. By the 18th, people handed out nuts, apples, and coins instead. And by the 19th century, when the Irish brought the tradition to America, the prayer had all but vanished, replaced by a cheerful question. Got anything sweet? Halloween had traded solemnity for sugar, and no one complained. Yet, hidden in the sugary chaos of modern candy culture, that old rhythm still beats. When a child knocks on a door in costume, it's a faint echo of those medieval prayers, a friendly reminder that generosity still lights the dark. Every door opened, every treat given, every laugh shared, all of it keeps that ancient promise alive. The living remembering the dead through kindness. And perhaps the ghosts are still grateful, because even now, across Britain and parts of Ireland, some families still bake soul cakes for All Hallows Eve. They leave a few on the hearth for unseen guests, and the rest they share with neighbors. The first one is always eaten silence. The last one with laughter. The ingredients haven't changed much: flour, butter, spice, and thyme. But the meaning has softened, aged like good bread. In the end, maybe that's all a soul cake ever was. A small, round hope that the dead could taste love, and that the living could sweeten the night just by caring. So, the next time you hand out candy on Halloween, the chocolate bars, the lollipops, the little wrappers rustling like leaves, know that you're part of the same old story. It just traded hymns for sugar. And somewhere, in the quiet between footsteps on your porch, you can almost hear the faint chorus of those medieval voices, still whispering through the centuries. A soul for a soul cake. And bless the good folks who still remember. For a long time, fear ruled Europe's nights. It crept through the forests, whispered through the cathedrals, and crouched behind every shadowy corner of a peasant's imagination. But then, somewhere between the bonfires and the bread, the masks and the music, something remarkable happened. Fear got funny. It didn't vanish. It evolved. People stopped trying to silence it and started inviting it to dinner, dressing it up, giving it names and punchlines. Halloween became the night when darkness finally got a sense of humor. You can almost pinpoint the moment. In the late Middle Ages, when plague and war had made half of Europe intimately acquainted with mortality, the continent's artists and storytellers began to flirt with the absurd. Monks doodled skeletons dancing in the margins of their illuminated manuscripts, a sort of divine comic relief between psalms. Painters filled church walls with murals called Danse Macabre, the dance of death. They showed skeletons leading kings, bishops, and farmers by the hand, all dancing in a great circle of equality. The message was grim but cheeky. Everyone dies. Might as well keep the rhythm. And Europe, exhausted by centuries of tragedy, loved it. In towns across France and Germany, processions began on All Hallows Eve, where people dressed as skeletons, ringing bells and singing mock dirges. They danced through graveyards, laughing at their own fragility. Even the priests sometimes joined in, carefully, of course, for the sake of doctrine. This wasn't mockery. It was medicine. In a world where death had been constant, laughter was a kind of exorcism. Every joke, every jingle, every bit of foolishness said, yes, death is waiting, but not tonight. By the 15th century, Halloween had quietly become Europe's unofficial comedy night. Villagers put on plays that mixed ghosts with gossip. Actors in skeleton costumes delivered sermons about vanity, then tripped over their own bones. Wives teased their husbands by dressing as demons and pretending to drag them to hell. Children carved grotesque faces in vegetables, then laughed until their candles sputtered out. It was the medieval version of stand-up, with slightly more theology. In Spain, these performances were called Danzas de la Muerte. In Italy, the carnival spirit of Venice seeped into October, masks, mischief, and music echoing down narrow canals. In England, the mummers' plays turned Halloween into a night of satire, where no lord or bishop was safe from a well-timed joke. The church, perhaps realizing that people needed a little comic relief, began to tolerate these festivities. They even used them to teach. The sermons of the time warned, laugh not to forget death, but to remember it kindly. It was in a way the birth of dark humor, the ability to stare into the abyss and smirk. As centuries passed, the laughter spread. When printing presses arrived, pamphlets about ghosts and night spirits sold like hotcakes. Some were serious, but most were delightfully ridiculous. Stories of monks who tried to exorcise a demon and ended up arguing about rent, or skeletons who interrupted funerals to complain about the hymn selection. Halloween had become less a night of dread and more a night of wit, a time to laugh at what scared you, to sing to the shadows instead of shrinking from them. Even the imagery softened. The skull, once a memento mori of grim reflection, became a kind of folk mascot, painted on banners, stitched on robes, carved into pastries. The same symbol that once warned of doom now grinned back, as if to say, "Boo, but nicely." By the Renaissance, laughter and fear were so intertwined that you could hardly separate them. Masquerade balls in late October filled castles with jesters dressed as devils, while peasants roasted apples by the fire, telling ghost stories that ended in punchlines. Because they'd learned something profound. Fear loses its power when you can laugh at it. That lesson never really went away. When we carve a pumpkin's grin or wear a silly costume, we're echoing those same villagers who turned the macabre into music. We're telling the darkness, we see you, we get the joke. And that's what makes Halloween different from every other night of the year. It's not about ignoring fear, it's about transforming it, taking what once ruled us and turning it into art, play, and light. Imagine it, a medieval village square lit by torches. A fiddler starts to play. Children chase one another in bone masks, laughing through the chill. A monk leans against a wall, smiling as a skeleton-shaped puppet scolds a greedy merchant. The fire crackles. Someone tells a story that makes everyone groan and grin at once. And for just a moment, life feels lighter. Because for all the ghosts and graves, for all the fear and faith, Halloween's greatest miracle was that it taught humanity how to laugh again. And every chuckle, every grin, every breath of joy in the cold autumn air was proof that even the scariest stories can end with a smile. Every year, when the harvest ended and the fires burned low, there came a night that didn't seem to belong to either season. It wasn't quite autumn anymore, but winter hadn't yet claimed the world. It was something in between, a pause, a breath, a hinge in time. The Celts called it Samhain, the night when the old year ended and the new one hadn't yet begun. To them, time wasn't a straight line, it was a circle. And at this turning point in the circle, everything loosened. The boundaries between light and dark, life and death, yesterday and tomorrow. Later generations forgot the old words, but they kept the feeling. By the Middle Ages, people still sensed that Halloween was a night out of step with the rest of the calendar. The air felt different, the stars sharper, the wind quieter, as if even the sky were listening. It was called the night between years. Crops were stored, animals brought in, debts settled, prayers said. Everything you hadn't done before this night, every chore, every apology, every letter, was supposed to be finished or carried with you into the cold. It was a time to let go or to be haunted by what you didn't. In Ireland, families would sit around the hearth and tell stories about the year gone by, who'd been born, who'd been buried, who'd been brave. Each tale ended not with applause, but with silence, that reverent space where memory and hope shake hands. In Wales, people lit threshold fires, small candles placed in doorways, one for the living and one for the dead. It was a symbolic exchange, light for those who'd left, warmth for those who stayed. In Germany and the Alps, it was said that on this night, the souls of the ancestors marched through the valleys, whispering blessings into the barns and fields. Farmers left their gates open so the spirits could pass through freely, taking nothing but the chill with them. And across France, people prepared a meal at midnight, bread, wine, and salt, and left it on the table while they slept. When they woke, if anything was disturbed, they smiled and said they visited. No one feared these moments. The dead weren't enemies. They were relatives on the longest commute imaginable. The living didn't tremble at their return. They made room for it. They understood that life wasn't something you owned, but something you shared. That's why Halloween was never just about ghosts. It was about balance. That delicate, perfect stillness between endings and beginnings. Even the natural world seemed to understand. The last leaves clung stubbornly to the branches, refusing to fall. The earth smelled of rain and ash and apples. The nights stretched long, but the moon grew large and golden, as if to say, "I'll light the way through." Time itself felt softer. The villagers said clocks and candles burned slower on Halloween, not in minutes or hours, but in mood. It was a night when things didn't quite behave like they usually did. The dogs barked at nothing. The wind changed direction. Even your reflection looked back a little differently. For the weary souls of the living, it was a chance to reset. You could release your mistakes into the smoke, whisper your regrets into the wind, or bury them in the garden beside last season's harvest. And in the morning, when frost glittered on the fields, you could pretend, just for a moment, that the world had forgiven you. The philosophers of the time said that Halloween was proof of divine mercy. The poets said it was proof of memory. The people said it was just how life worked. The dead visit, the living listen, and then everyone moves on. Perhaps that's why, even today, Halloween feels more reflective than the bright chaos of other holidays. Beneath the candy and costumes, there's still that quiet heartbeat, that pause in time when everything feels possible. It's the night when the veil doesn't just lift between the living and the dead, but between who we were and who we might still become. So imagine it. The bonfire down to embers, the stars trembling over an empty field, the last lantern flickering in a cottage window. Somewhere, a voice whispers goodnight. A door closes softly, and for just a breath, the whole world stands still, suspended between years, like a single flame that hasn't yet decided whether to go out or to rise again. That's Halloween's oldest secret, not fear, not death, but renewal. A reminder that even the ending of the year is just another beginning, waiting quietly in the dark, ready to be named. And so, as the last candle burns down and the wind turns colder, we come to the end of our journey, not just through history, but through the quiet heart of Halloween itself. It began, long ago, with fire and fear, with people huddled under thatched roofs, whispering to the dark and hoping it wouldn't whisper back. It grew into song, laughter, masks, bread, and light. And somehow, through plagues, prayers, and pumpkin lanterns, it became what it is now, a night that belongs to everyone. The Europe of 1,000 years ago would hardly recognize our world. No castles ring their bells anymore. The roads are paved, the forests trimmed, the wolves long gone. And yet, every October, something ancient stirs again, a memory flickering behind every window, every bonfire, every porch light. The old ways never vanished. They just changed costumes. The turnip became the pumpkin. The bonfire became the candle in the window. The soul cakes became chocolate bars. The prayers became parties. The fears became fun. And the spirits became stories, the kind we tell to each other when the night feels just a little too quiet. But beneath it all, beneath the costumes, the candy, the jokes, the heartbeat of the old Halloween still echoes. It's in the way we light things when the world goes dark, in the way we laugh at what once terrified us, in the way we still open our doors, still share what we have, still make room for the invisible, whether that means ghosts or just the people we've lost. Because Halloween, at its core, was never really about death. It was about connection. About remembering that the living and the dead, the past and the present, are just neighbors separated by a thin, polite curtain. And once a year, that curtain moves. In some quiet corner of Europe, there's still a candle burning tonight in a small church, its flame trembling like a heartbeat inside a glass. Outside, the fields are sleeping. The apple trees stand bare and silver. Somewhere, a bell tolls, slow, steady, patient. And if you listen closely, you might hear more than just wind. You might hear footsteps, soft, measured, human. You might hear laughter from a century ago, or the faint clatter of a wooden cart on a long-forgotten road. You might even hear the voices of the people we've been talking about all this time. The monks, the peasants, the dancers, the bakers, the witches, the children with their turnip lanterns, all of them still here, somewhere, carried forward on the stories we keep telling. Because history, like Halloween, doesn't end. It lingers. It circles back. It waits for us to light the fire again. And maybe that's why the night feels so peaceful when it finally falls. Because even though everything changes, the language, the rituals, the reasons, the need remains the same. We still want to believe that what's gone isn't really gone, that the people we miss can still find their way home by candlelight. That laughter can coexist with ghosts. That warmth, no matter how small, still wins against the cold. So as the last flame gutters and the smoke curls upward into the starless sky, imagine it drifting across the continent, over the old churchyards of England, the foggy lakes of Ireland, the quiet forests of Germany, the snow-dusted mountains of France, and the cobbled streets of Rome. Each place holds a piece of the story. Each echo finds its way home. The Europe of Halloween isn't a place on a map. It's a feeling, a mixture of reverence and mischief, of memory and warmth. It's the comfort of knowing that even as centuries pass, we still keep the same promise: to remember, to light, to laugh. And somewhere, across that endless dark, the ancestors are smiling. Not because we still believe in them exactly, but because we've learned to believe in the same things they did. In light, in kindness, and in the quiet courage of those who face the dark with a grin. So as you settle into bed tonight, listening to the hum of the world slowing down, know that you're part of a very old story. One that began before the first church bell, before the first prayer, before even the first carved turnip. It's the story of humanity's truest tradition: to gather around the fire, share the warmth, and whisper to the night, "We're still here." And the night, if you listen carefully, always whispers back,